origins of these national feelings in people. It's part of their repudiation of the Enlightenment, but also it reflected their genuine interest in finding this out. We talked in a little bit earlier in the unit, when we were talking about nationalism, we talked about this guy named Johann Gottfried von Herder, Herder, and we talked about him coming up with this concept called Volkgeist, okay, the spirit of the people, okay, folk spirit, the characteristics of the people. Just like you probably in English with Mr. Frobe, you talk about Zeitgeist, let's talk about Volkgeist, okay? And he said that every individual nation, national group, like an organism, like a living organism, had its own distinct characteristics and really personality, which he called Volkgeist. And he said that conditioned each nation and nationality's own pattern of historical growth and development over time. And he said, you really want to check out and get an insight into what really makes a people tick and what really is at the heart of what makes them who they are. You got to look at their literature. You look at their traditional literature, their folk tales, their poems, and their folk songs even. You start looking at that, that's where you get some insight into what the people are all about. And as the German Romantic writers of the period started embracing this, they went back scurrying about, the countryside, collecting folk tales. That's where the Grimm brothers did that, and that's where the Grimm brothers fairy tales come from. It comes out of this Romantic era. They went around and into villages all over Germany and collected traditional folklore stories, a lot of which in their original form are pretty gruesome and gory. But it was all part of this trying to get to the heart and soul of what it was to be German. Remember, the Germans are particularly moved to do this because that's really all that's holding them together as a people at this time. There is no unified Germany. They're politically fragmented into God knows how many states, about 39 by this point. And they're looking for, what's the glue that holds Germans together? Well, our culture, our language, our culture, our literature, our folk stories, our folk songs. And so part of that lies at the heart of their desire to go back and collect as much of the stuff as they could. And at the same time, they went back and said, let's develop some really uniquely German literature. Let's stop copying French neoclassical forms. Number one, it's neoclassical and too rigid. Number two, it's French and we're German. We should have our own. Okay. So that's what's going on there. The Herder's concept of Volkgeist. In England, this strand of writing and sort of mindset can be traced to the immensely popular Sir Walter Scott. And Sir Walter Scott collected medieval folk ballads in England, especially right up on the borderlands between England and Scotland. He also wrote somewhere around 30 novels, the most famous of which is Ivanhoe, which is set in the period of Richard and King John. And actually, Robin Hood makes an appearance in the novel Ivanhoe. The English desire to go back and bring back the Robin Hood stories and legends all comes in this Romantic period too. Russia, the first Russian writer that we've even really remotely discussed, Alexander Pushkin, born 1799, died 1837, wrote the first major works of Russian literature in the vernacular, in Russian, about the Russian past, about the time of troubles in Boris Godunov. Again, that was just an example, took examples from Russian history and threw in a little local, regional flavor and color to it, and there you go. The French even got in on the game too, and there were some French writers who rebelled against the Enlightenment and their own neoclassicism. For example, the writer Chateaubriand, published in 1802 his work called The Genius of Christianity. An Enlightenment thinker wouldn't have been caught dead writing a work called The Genius of Christianity, but here we are, 1802, and Chateaubriand's doing it. Madame de Stael, a woman and a real thorn in the side of Napoleon Bonaparte. She was constantly criticizing Napoleon's regime, but she was so highly regarded and famous that Napoleon never felt, and she was a woman too, so he never really felt comfortable with, sending his minions out to grab her and throw her in the slammer somewhere. But he drove him to distraction with her criticism. She was actually the daughter of the former French finance minister Jacques Necker, who was around during the demise of Louis XVI's regime. She wrote something called Concerning Germany, which was a call to the French that, remember, they're also descended from the Franks as well as the Romans. So they do share this sort of barbarian Germanic tribe past along with the Germans. But probably the most famous French romantic writer is Victor Hugo, who flouted as many classical rules in his works as he possibly could, and the traditionalists were absolutely outraged at his work and said it's garbage. But tons of people still read it today. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo, set in the 1830 Revolution. Countless stories by Hugo. Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Mis are probably the most famous. Another French writer of the period who wrote about, the romantic love of nature and about, just where social ideals and norms and culture comes from, was the novelist George Sand. That was a pen name. It was actually a woman. Who took the pen name of George Sand. Okay, so as you can see, each country had its own sort of national romantic characteristics in literature. Okay, couple more things to go briefly, and then we're about done. Music. Probably the mode of artistic expression where the romantic sort of spirit is most poignantly carried out. Free expression and emotional intensity. One of the things that happens in the Romantic era is that orchestras get huge. They start to get really big. Part of it is you have developments in instruments. You now have essentially modern brass and woodwind instruments. You now have the piano. Before you had the harpsichord, which has absolutely no sustain at all. It's one of its characteristics. You hit something on the harpsichord, and it's like, there's no sustain to it. You hit something on the piano, especially with one of the sustain pedal pressed in, man, you can boom a chord on the piano, last for minutes and minutes and minutes. Beatles' Day in the Life, the end of Sgt. Pepper. Percussion also. So the size and the sort of different range of sounds and timbre and color that you could produce with an orchestra just vastly more broad. Plus the volume too is a lot louder. It sort of strikes us funny to think, an orchestra being like this loud, like raucous thing. But in the early 19th century, that's what it was. And musicians gained a lot of prestige. The musical genius, somebody that could develop incredibly emotive, fantastic skill on an instrument. The idea of a virtuoso, for example, comes out of the Romantic period. The virtuoso performer. The Italian violinist and guitarist Niccolo Paganini. He was really the first rock star. Really, honestly, he was like a rock star. Paganini had long, flowing, curling black hair, and by all accounts, incredibly handsome. Was very, flashy and dashing. And when he'd play, women would scream. It was almost like Beatlemania back in the 19th century. And they'd faint. And he was so incredible. I mean, people still can't figure out some of the stuff that he did on the violin and the guitar. And he was such he sold his soul to the devil to acquire this fantastic playing skill. But he's really sort of the Romantic era, 19th century era version of a rock star. Franz Liszt, Hungarian composer. There you go. Piano, incredibly complicated, like just really incredibly emotive piano works. Chopin, Poland, very national. Polonaise, Polish nationalism. That's a no-no. Russians don't like Polish nationalism. They come in and, right? But the most famous example of the Romantic genre music, Ludwig van Beethoven. Said it all right there. A lot of different themes and tones, a lot of dramatic conflicts in his work. Just incredible range of music. He really was, as your author says too, he's really the first to really exploit the sound and the range of the piano. So, Romantic music. Think Beethoven. Okay, art. Just to wrap up, a couple of artists, and then we're done with Romanticism. In France, the most famous Romantic artist, Eugene Delacroix, who, by the way, Delacroix, by all accounts, the rumor was at the time, and historians are pretty darn sure it's true, was probably the illegitimate son of our old friend, Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Yes, one more evidence of we can't get rid of Talleyrand. We have his supposed illegitimate progeny now, the famous artist Eugene Delacroix. A lot of really emotional, colorful scenes, etc. Liberty Leading the People. Very famous work. Inspired by the 1830 Revolution. Delacroix, female liberty. Astride the barricade with a banner, leading the revolutionary people on to their freedom and victory. Tugs at the heart. In England, you had John Constable, who his paintings look like Wordsworth poems sound. It's the best way that I can describe it. Very sort of pastoral, gentle nature scenes, the unspoiled nature of rural England, people living out there in village life or at one with the environment, sort of, hey man, commune with nature kind of thing. And then we have J.M.W. Turner, who we've talked about. He was really about nature's power and terror, and a lot of his early paintings were ships at sea during violent storms. And raging storms, sinking ships. Like, here comes, you got this magnificent creation of humanity, a sailing ship. It's pretty impressive, pretty big. But it's nothing against the overwhelming force of this giant wall of water coming at it. So mankind, they think they're pretty cool. Nature can take away what they did just like that. The awe-inspiring force and wonder and power of nature. Yes, and of course, in Spain, Francisco Goya, who one of the famous Spanish court painters, and of course his most famous work is during the Napoleonic era. It's in your book, The Spanish Partisans. The guerrilla fighters, the Spanish, are about to have been captured and about to be executed by a French firing squad, and one of the figures is sort of bathed in this kind of spotlight glow, this light, the light of holiness, and he's spread out like this, about to be shot, almost like he's being crucified, like a Christ-like figure being sacrificed, a martyr who's giving his life to save his people. Very famous Goya work. I suggest that you really want to get a handle on Romantic art. Go to the Web Gallery of Art. The link